Hello everybody, I'm InTheLittleWood, also known as Martin, and welcome back to the channel. So, over the weekend, Hytale's content manager Moo and also Chris Thurston from the publishing team at Hypixel Studios headed over to EGX Rezzed, which is kind of like a convention in London, and it's a mixture and leans slightly more towards the development side of video games, rather than just it being a show floor where you can play things. And there they gave us a presentation about the history of Hypixel Studios, how it started out as just a Minecraft server, developed into an indie studio, and where it's working at today. And along the way they show us some really cool screenshots and little video clips, not only of like some of the early phases of Hytale and some of those kind of like, you know, first building blocks of them making the game, but also some brand new up-to-date footage of Zone 3 that we'll get to play in Orbis. So as always, I prefer to go through this in chronological order, so if you are looking for just the Borea stuff, the new gameplay footage, then that'll be slightly towards the end of the video. But all of this stuff I think is personally quite interesting to their ethos and their mindset when it came to building this game. So early on they give a brief introduction as to what Hytale is. They play the trailer, everybody's kind of caught up to speed, and then they talk about the three individual kind of components of the game, if you will. They speak about, of course, the adventure mode, then they talk about the mini games, and whilst they're mentioning the mini games, they talk about how some of them are competitive but others will be collaborative. It's been quite typical of mini game servers over the years to not really have too much in terms of PvE elements, but obviously given the style of game that Hytale is and how advanced they can get with the model maker as well as the base engine that they themselves have created, we could be in for some really cool experiences, whether it's just a kind of a recreation of, you know, zombies from those old Call of Duty games and other things like that. I'm intrigued to see where they go with it. And then they hit the rewind button and go all the way back to the start, the early sort of 2012, 2011 area where Minecraft kind of first burst onto the scene, and they talk about how they used to create maps like Herobrine's Mansion, Wrath of the Fallen, Zombie Apocalypse, and even Herobrine's Return. I think I've played every single one of those. But if you remember back in the early days, we didn't have Bedrock and there wasn't an easy marketplace in order to download these maps, and especially not safely either. So this kind of set the foundation for how Hytale and Hypixel work as a whole. They find a problem, they overcome it. They find the next problem, they overcome it, rinse, repeat. And with this one, they basically decided, right, well, rather than have people having to download the maps, install them, potentially having viruses and people pretending to be them with zip files and things like that, why don't we just create an online network where people can log in and play these maps together without having to install any mods? And that is where the Hypixel server originated. Turns out that back in the day, I don't even remember this personally, but apparently it used to be only their adventure maps that you could play on the server, so bear in mind that was probably only for upwards of 4 people per load. So occasionally the queue times could end up being quite long, so they decided to create various different mini games that would just be like little bite-sized experiences that would work as a distraction tool to keep people occupied whilst they're waiting for a lobby to enter. Apparently the very first game was actually paintball, which is interesting, and then of course as the years have gone on they realised that that was actually the key market for people, and they developed things like Bed Wars, Sky Wars, Build Battle and the like. At one point that I thought was really impressive actually was the fact that Sky Wars, from concept to coding to being in the player's hands, was all done in the space of 9 days. Wow. And it's that kind of efficiency and that kind of polish which makes me really excited for Hytale. Some people keep telling me not to get too excited and not to get too overhyped. I personally feel as though I'm living in the realm of possibility and being quite fair with my assumptions. But anyway, let's get back to the topic. So, Moo went on to talk about how they felt as though that they created the Hypixel network, but it was like building their house on somebody else's land, and they really felt the effects when the EULA changes happened. So if you don't remember, the EULA is the End User License Agreement. This is essentially a legal contract that is signed or agreed upon when you install a copy of Minecraft or when you download the server exe in order to run yourself a Minecraft server. The reason Mojang had to make these changes is because there were so many people making extortionate amounts of money off of people that were pretty vulnerable, honestly. They wanted cosmetics, they occasionally wanted a slight pay-to-win aspect to the game, and Mojang just weren't about that. When these changes went into effect, Moo says that the server's revenue dropped by upwards of 85%. Bear in mind, they have coders, they've got, you know, moderation teams, they've got forums to look after, they've got support tickets to fill out, a whole commerce system. Losing all that revenue is going to make it very difficult to keep the company afloat. So this was the wake-up call. This was the sort of push initially to mature the company's goals and basically try and consider becoming an indie dev, because they'd worked on so many mini games, but all of them lived within the constricts that Minecraft provided, because one of the charms of the Hypixel network is that everything was always vanilla. You never had to install any kind of mods in order to play it, but it meant that restrictions restrictions came with that. Just as a little side note before we move on as well, Hytale and Hypixel have never been upset that Minecraft changed these rules, because ultimately they were only trying to protect the players and they were completely within their rights, as much as Moo said. So it was around about that time where they spliced off 3 of their developers to begin Hypixel Studios and start forming what would now become Hytale. So here is where we get into the really interesting stuff. So looking at the video right here, around about 1619, if you want to go and find it for yourselves, you can see one of the earliest renditions and kind of the first steps into the world of Hytale, with some initial building blocks in place. And it's really interesting to see certain design choices were prominent in the earliest versions of Hytale. Let's talk for example about the leaf blocks. You can already see here that they weren't the rigid cubes that we were used to seeing in Minecraft. They were the more sort of sporadic and crazy and fun looking leaves as you would see in real life. Even some of the smaller details like the rock piles actually had that slightly more realistic geometry to them rather than just being a set square, and even things like the skybox already looked lush. And if you take a look on the right hand side of the screen, as well as actually by the coastline where the little beach is, you can actually see that block blending and those textures spilling over from one to another is already in action too. Impressive. Moving a little bit forward through the video to 1734, and you can notice some interesting generation designs, particularly when it comes to transitioning areas between 2 biomes. And within this as well, Moo emphasizes here that zones and biomes are completely different beasts, and that's something we get to see demonstrated later on, so let's put a pin in that for now. Fast forward now to 18 minutes and 20 seconds, and we start to see a more fleshed out version of the Emerald Grove as it makes its way through the foliage stage. So there's more shrubbery, there's more texture blending, and there's even loads of flowers. And here as well we get to see what I assume is actually a dirt block, which looks a little bit different to the modern day one that we know of from the trailers. Basically, the yellow blotches on it are a little softer nowadays, so they kind of reduce that harshness as time's gone on. From here, Moo goes on to talk about the mindset and the locked vision that you can fall into when you've only had a certain set of tools for so long. Your brain kind of gets stuck in this area where you think, yep, I've hit the ceiling with this project, I can't do anything more, but now they actually have the devices and the tools, because they've created the engine as well as all the server-side stuff, to create absolutely anything. They can add, remove, change, chop, develop any mechanics or code anything that they need, and this was a bit of a stepping stone for the developers to try and break into. But they found their stride, and actually now we move on to a screenshot which is only dated as being 1 year old. So at 1943 in the presentation, we can see a screenshot which basically shows off Zone 1, which is obviously the Emerald Grove, with some brand new render improvements. We've got particle effects in place with those slight firefly glows and stuff, which is cool, a bit of ambient occlusion, some of the tinted blocks from the RGB sliders, and of course an evocative skybox. Immediately there's such a tone and an aura about this place that really gives it a mystical, adventurous vibe, which is 100% what the team are going for. I'm going to assume that all the screenshots from this segment are around about a year old, so here from last year is a look at Zone 2, the Howling Sands, and right up atop the hill there we've seen, I think for the first time, some baobab trees. Those are the sort of flat top ones, they really remind me of the Lion King. But the more interesting topic that I want to talk about here is actually the dirt trail going through the centre. Now this could just be naturally generated, but it seems as though the path is actually made of a more man-made stone, or chalk, or elf, whatever it is. But basically that has me wondering, are there going to be certain points of interest that are going to be so prominent that there are actually roads and signs and paths that actually lead to each of them? So you could be out exploring the wilderness and suddenly you see a signpost and a little sort of dirt trail that might lead you to a giant city or a citadel, or maybe a castle or a stronghold. That would be really cool in my opinion. It would be a much more organic way of coming across points of interest rather than just loading up a map or being told where to go. You could be absolutely lost for 20-25 minutes and then all of a sudden there are some signs of civilization that you can follow if you want to. The next screenshot we're provided with gives us one of our first proper looks at Zone 3, known as Borea. Now this is typically shown off to be a slightly more snowy area in the concept art, particularly from the World Generation blog post, but the biomes that reside within it are going to have some drier patches and some snowier patches, and this is one of the first proper demonstrations of how vastly different things can get inside of one zone. It's at this point in the presentation that Moo wants to hit the rewind button again and go back to some of the earlier portions of Hytale. In this screenshot we can see a load of the staff members gathered together for probably the very first time. Basically none of the Hypixel team are actually in the same location, there's no central office, everybody is external, everybody works from their own homes. It's an interesting setup. So Moo told us that this is one of their first interpersonal experiences, which is a really cool way for it to come about. Originally people are just, avatars and their names on a Discord or a TeamSpeak, and then all of a sudden they have actual physical walking talking bodies. It's great. In this screenshot though we can see that various players have their names above their heads. It's simple white text, there's no grey box is just solely their username. I love that even though nobody has ever registered usernames inside of this game, that somebody still felt the need to put numbers in their name. Come on, Elise! Anyway, I do want to address this topic just really quickly because we haven't really spoken yet about how names will be demonstrated inside of not only adventure mode, but also in servers and in mini-games, because you know from your own experiences and mine as well, that you can be unaware of a player's existence nearby you, but the moment they uncrouch, their name becomes visible through the wall. It's just like looking at a skeleton with an X-ray. It sucks. It's probably safe to assume that given how customizable Hytale seems to be at the moment, that it wouldn't be too much of a surprise if name tags were a property that you could enable and disable at will, and not just on the client side either for yourself. Server owners could actually just decide for themselves whether their minigame or their adventure map actually would benefit from having usernames on or off. For most of them, I'd imagine off. Because typically to identify an enemy in these games, whether it be Bed Wars, Sky Wars, whatever else it might be, you usually either recognise that the skin isn't one that you're playing with and you're partied with, or they just simply have coloured armour. Now, if you remember back in the trailer for Hytale when it was first revealed and we saw the minigames lobby, you can tell that there are going to be a lot of people inside of there. And one thing that I've always felt with Minecraft is that when you're in these very populated areas, the name tags become very overbearing and it just becomes a bit of a mess. I personally would really like it if there was some kind of range detection on the characters to decide whether or not to show them your username. So imagine if only people within a 5-block radius's names appear because they're nearby, there's someone that you might want to communicate with, but old Jerry that's on a hill 20 blocks away, you can see him, but you don't necessarily need to be able to read his name from that far. Or there may just be 3 solid options of visible through walls, visible in line of sight, so if you had a wall between you, you couldn't see it, and finally, just turning them off. I know I've gone on about this a little bit, but it is one of those things that I've always felt has kind of plagued the experience, whether it be visually or mechanically in the past. Alright, we're going from the past all the way back to the current day, and we're making our way to 2135 in the presentation for a very brief dip into the model maker. So Mood talks about how it's evolved from the Craft Studio software, and on the screen we can see an animation of something known as a Tetra bird. So we have actually seen these previously in the Happy Holidays Christmas post that the Hytale team did over on social media, but we never actually knew what its name was. Now we do. And that brings us through to the current day of Hytale, according to Moo, and he's told us that internally they've had various different mod jams and game jams. Essentially, these are where you take a group of people, you split them off into teams, you give them the same set of tools, and you say, right, you have got 24 hours, 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever time limit you want to set, to create a new game or a new concept or a new anything, really. And I can imagine that this is going to lead to some really awesome mini games for the servers, probably going to lead to some really interesting boss encounters and mob mechanics for the players inside of Hytale. It likely also triggers a need for certain features that they don't currently have, so they can pass that to the coding team to enhance the engine to be able to support it. And just before we get into that brand new footage of Borea for Zone 3, we did get a public confirmation from Moo that the model maker will be free, completely free, no pennies to spend. It's going to come with the base game of Hytale on launch, and it's nice to have that confirmed publicly. Here we are then, Zone 3 in Orbis is known as Borea, and it's a particularly snowy biome, and we start off with this shot right here of one of the slightly chillier parts of the climate, and in full view there we can see a snow wolf. This is our first time seeing them inside of the game, because previously we'd only ever seen them in the environment and creatures concept art running alongside a fawn. It's here as well where we get to appreciate the very gentle snowfall effect, which I really like. It's not quite as dense as some other block-based games have it, and then we can see of course things like the frosted grass as opposed to the regular tall grass, and the various different types of leaves on the trees. The next biome we get to see is a slightly more river-based landscape. You can see a change in the foliage again, a polar bear chilling out on a rock, and a point of interest on the left hand side. Potentially it's a small outpost, or maybe just an independent farm. Having watched a lot of the Amazon show Vikings recently, I am getting some real Scandinavian vibes from this. It's awesome. And I'm really enjoying the weather and fog effects as well that really kind of add that sense of depth and distance to the mountains that are off in the far back. And here we get a demonstration that not every area of Borea is going to be absolutely covered in snow. We've already seen a relatively sparse and open land, which was covered in mostly green, but this area has the tall trees which are kind of acting as an umbrella to stop the potential snow from getting in. And if you have a little look on the floor right there, just in the bottom right corner, you can see a pine cone. I love my little details. Oh, look at the cute little mouse! Or is it a rat? It's one or the other, but look how cute it looks. It's adorable. Anyway, that's not even the coolest part of this screenshot. If you look a little bit upwards, look at the stars in the sky. Look at the way that the moon or maybe the setting sun is glowing. Look at the way that it's just sort of breaking around the side of the tree and slicing the fog. It's just so nice. Next up, we're pulling back from a wall of ice, and you can see in its underbelly that we have got what should normally be a relatively deep dark cave, but instead is being lit up by various different icebergs and stalactites. I think the glow from the one by the entrance at the top is a little bit excessive. Like, that's got a radius of like 10 blocks for one singular piece. Now this location right here would look like potentially a point of interest to me, but I can be pretty certain that this is just a random generation and it just happens to look that cool. And now we are headed deeper underground, and the only thing lighting our path currently are a couple of mushrooms. I really enjoy this kind of glowing inside of the caves. You notice that some of the various ores throughout Hytale will do the same as well. Whether it be thorium or cobalt, they all seem to emit the same sort of light, and I think it's such a cooler way of making your way through a tunneling system. Rather than it being pitch black, you walk forwards a few steps into the darkness, place a torch, and then suddenly you're max light, and then you walk into the darkness again, max light. It's a much more fluid and ominous trail to follow. I know that for myself, I would enjoy seeing, like, you know, my tunnel end with its lighting, there being a long stretch, but in the distance underneath the earth, you can see just another glowing mushroom, and I potentially might just risk it and try and run from one to the other, just to see if I can make it without getting harmed. This system as well also allows us to preserve a little bit more in terms of our torches, which means that we don't have to worry so much about carrying an infinite number of them. I really don't know how they've done it, but I look at this shot right here and I think, my god, that looks so bitterly cold. Like, I can almost feel it, like I can feel my skin getting goosebumpy. But in this shot right here, you can see what seems to be a checkpoint, if you will, of a mining strip. If we take a little look in the bottom right corner as well, you can see we've got a bed of lava, and obviously given that the snowfall is coming from the roof, and I think that is just a very dark skyline around those blocks, I think this is actually higher up a mountain rather than deep underground. We've got those strange tendril plants which give off another really soft lantern effect, and speaking of lanterns, we do actually have another brand new one right here. It seems to be almost like a sheet white block which is surrounded by a metal caging that sits atop a pole. Nifty. If you can pause the video at just the right point, in the back left there, you can actually see another iteration of the furnace. Pretty cool. But the one point in this video that really interests me is if you take a little look inside of the little workshop at the back there, you can see some kind of bench or a block which is emitting a 3 or 2 phase animation, and I can't decide for the life of me what it is. Is it an enchanter? Is it a healing station? Is it just like... I don't know. I really don't know. I'd love to hear from you guys what you think it is. This next shot, without a doubt, is probably one of my favourites from this whole presentation. One, because the skybox has got the real Northern Lights vibe going on. The crescent moon is really subtle, but it adds a nice mood to the environment. And speaking of mood, it seems as though we have got a few pools of purple here, which leads into my predicted story for Borea. So if you didn't catch my previous video, I scooped together all of the concept art and screenshots that we had of Zone 3 and settled on a rough theory that this zone right here and these types of environments are going to be the first introduction to the main threat of adventure mode. This is going to be the first sort of iterations of Varin trying to come from Nexus to the mainland of Orbis, or the main planet of Orbis, and start to take over. I think that camps like this and pools like this are going to be things that we have to neutralize alongside the Fawns in order to drive the Outlanders away and keep a hold on our lands. And you can tell they're creepy as well, right? We've got chains, we've got skulls lining around them. It all looks very ritualistic, and I can't wait to dive in. Not into the pool of purple, obviously. I'm on about just jumping into a fight. And then there's an owl. He doesn't care. He doesn't give a damn. There's also another new type of torch as well. If you have a little look over by one of the pools of purple, you can see that we've got a torch which starts with wood on the bottom. It has the flame out the top as you usually do, but it also is surrounded by a metal casing on the top, which I'm assuming is acting as some kind of windbreaker. So there we are. That is all of the brand new information in regards to Zone 3 Borea from EGX Rezzed. Before they wrapped up, they did actually jump into a Q&A session, so I'm going to go through some of the questions and answers and elaborate on some stuff. So the first question that was asked was in regards to people building their own servers within the game of Hytale, and basically Moo turned around and was like, well, when you go to Disneyland, you pay at the door and all the rides are free. They want to apply that same ethos to the way that servers run inside of Hytale, and that was about as much as they elaborated on for now, but he did tease that essentially they're going to be ranking servers, probably behind the scenes and less so a blatant, like, you know, label stuck on the server. But essentially he spoke about white, grey and black, essentially where white is a server that Hytale or Hypixel Studios themselves deem as a wholesome, pretty by the book server, grey would be slightly off-brand, but they're not doing anything inherently wrong, and then a black server would literally be blacklisted, and they won't be listing it on the server list of Hytale. But there was some interesting wording in regards to the server list, which kind of threw me off a little bit. So Moo mentioned that essentially when you click on the servers tab when you load the game up, the only server that would be listed there to begin with is the official Hytale server. Now that already throws me a little bit, because I always assumed that their server was simply going to be the minigames tab. Genuinely, that's what I thought it was going to be. So that's got me wondering, do the Hytale team actually have more experiences prepared for us as players outside of adventure mode and minigames? Potentially. Moving on for a few more questions, and we got the usual one about, do you think Hytale will crush Minecraft? And as always, the same tone and the same message that Hytale are putting out there is, both games can exist very happily, we're each happy for one another's success, let's just play games and have fun. And then the final question they got was in regards to console version and whether it would ever be a thing. And surprisingly, the answer was very optimistic. It was very heavily emphasized by Moo that the PC and Mac versions have their absolute undivided attention at the moment. They are laser sighted onto that, but console is an avenue that they would like to explore in the future, but all of their current developers are all desktop related. I think it would be sensible for everybody to assume that a console version is at least a year or two away. I think it's going to be a case of they'll launch the PC and Mac versions, they'll get that stable, they'll get everybody in a happy place with it, and then they will start to consider console options. Like honestly, I wouldn't expect to see a console version until like 2022 or something like really absurd like that. I mean, we don't even know when the beta is for PC, let alone anything else after that. But whilst we're on this topic, I think it is interesting to talk about whether or not Hytale will actually develop the console version themselves. They could go ahead and hire a ton of people who are console aficionados, get them well versed on the game, and then have them go away and recreate it, or they could potentially hire in an external studio to work on it. This could be a similar harmony that Mojang struck with 4J Studios to bring Minecraft to the Xbox and various other consoles. I know normally handing over your IP to other people is scary, but when you have a pre-existing game and all you have to say to them is, hey, make it exactly like this, but just make it with a joystick and some buttons, I can't imagine that's too much of a risky process, especially if you get final approval before it gets out to stores and into your players' hands. And just before people start typing in the comments, I'm well aware that developing a console version is literally building it from the ground up. It's not just a make it work with an Xbox controller. I just want to nip that one in the bud real quick. But anyway, that is it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. In the description you can find the URL to the full EGX upload from the presentation. It's around about 30 minutes long, which is nearly as long as this video, but we went off on trails and we examined and analysed, which is what we do in all of these videos. So with these brand new glimpses of Borea, which zone out of the first three that we've been shown in detail, so the Emerald Grove and the Howling Sands included in that, which is your favourite so far? Which are you most excited for? I can't wait to read those in the comment section below. For me personally, it's between the Emerald Grove and Borea, but I think the fact that the Quebecs are in zone 1, that's tipping it in their favour. So have a wonderful day. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, merch, bell, support a creator code and all of that. Bye!